Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ambily Banerjee. Now, Ambily started her career as a postdoctoral scientist following a PhD in molecular biology. She spent many years working with academia and now works within GSK, a well-known organization and pharma brand. And Ambily works as a director within the Therapeutic group inside the Regulatory Affairs division. She's held a number of roles both inside and outside the organization, where she drives strongly towards an equal society for all in business. She has worked closely with the Black and Asian and minority ethnic colleagues within the organisation and is the deputy chair of the network of networks delivering impact training for various organisations. Ambily also serves on the board for a not-for-profit and works with a local charity at the Slough Council for Voluntary Services. Wow, so a lot there, Ambily. Tell me a little bit about, to kickstart things, more about your background and actually how you came to be where you are today.
Thank you for this opportunity, Leila. So dialing back right to the beginning. So I was born as an only child to parents in Kerala in India. And I moved to the UK when I was 13. And the mantra I heard from my very feminist role model father was, you as a girl will have more barriers compared to boys, but you can achieve anything a boy can achieve. You know, never tell yourself that you're not good enough. So I had this growing up. So I aimed for the stars. You know, I believed I could achieve anything. And I did a PhD in molecular biology. And as you mentioned, ended up in academia. But looking up at academia, I could see that the professors were all predominantly male. And I really felt, especially when I had started a family and felt that I needed to kind of have a work-life balance, I felt may not be the environment where I can achieve success. You know, it doesn't seem to have flexible working opportunities, etc. So my number one reason actually for moving into the pharmaceutical sector, particularly at GSK, was because I could see women at the top of the organization. And I thought, wow, you know, if I move to an organization where there is equality, then I have greater chances of success. So I moved to GSK within regulatory affairs 13 years ago. And actually had a spectacular rise, partly because I was very lucky to have a sponsor very early on in my career who helped me navigate that path. So I moved from an entry-level position at GSK to a director position within about 6 years. And thought at that point in time, the world's my oyster. And as I started looking for my next position a few years later, I realized actually I've hitting some barriers here, you know, not entirely sure what I should do differently. So I started moving laterally and started gaining experience in other parts of the business. I started doing secondments, even went externally on a secondment outside of GSK, and still couldn't quite secure the next role at a senior level. And that's the point at which I thought, what's going on here? Is it just me, or is there something about the environment? And I came to the employee resource groups that GSK had, and sharing my experiences with various others, I realized that actually organizationally there's some work to do in the corporate sector. In many organizations, when you hit a certain level of management, beyond that seems to be much harder for ethnic minorities to navigate. So over the last couple of years, I've been leading the employee resource group at GSK called Embrace, that focuses on race and ethnicity issues. And I'm also sitting on an external panel, the TNON membership that you mentioned, which is working with 120 organizations, network leads, to share best practices and identify what organizations are doing across the UK to really prioritize equity for ethnic minorities. So that's been my journey so far. And within my company, we've made huge strides of progress over the last couple of years, particularly since George Floyd's murder. I think we've really seen an absolute awakening, cultural awakening, right? Organizations have gone, okay, we were doing something on gender, but there hasn't been enough focus on race. And we've really seen that acceleration of what can be done in a company. So I'll stop there.
Well, Ambily, first and foremost, thank you ever so much for sharing. And Kurla, what a beautiful part of the world. My brother's wife is from Kurla, actually, and lives here now in the UK. And whilst I haven't been, I cannot wait to go, because wow, the culture there, what I hear, and in particular, how interesting to see that cultural dynamic and how that translates across the pond here to the UK. But I must just kickstart us off by saying, tell me about your original name, because I know before the podcast I said Ambily, what a lovely name, and you said, actually, Leila, that name is one that's easier to pronounce, and it made me actually think, to start off with, what is your full name, and tell us why and where that came from, because we're talking on this podcast very much about the intersect between ethnicity, also between gender, also with culture, and what our organizations can do, should this not to an extent start off with how we correctly pronounce, and how we shouldn't necessarily need to simplify our being for Western, say, culture.
Absolutely. So I was born Ambily, or I should pronounce it properly. The way it was intended is Ambily Bhaskaran. So my family name is Bhaskaran. In the South, it's a very common surname. And actually, I was named Ambily, which means the moon, because my surname means the sun. So my dad had this very symbolic meaning of, these celestial bodies. But people found it incredibly difficult to pronounce Bhaskaran. So it was very rarely used. And actually, when I got married and my name moved to Banerjee, it was slightly easier for people to pronounce it. But my first name has always been tricky for individuals. So when even in India, I should say that in Kerala, people are used to this name. It's a very common name. But Ambily is a hard name for even North Indians to kind of roll their tongue for. So when I moved to the UK, particularly, it was such an unusual name that I didn't want it completely mispronounced, almost pronounced with a U emphasis. So I simplified it to the phonetic pronunciation. I thought at least I'll know consistently that people are calling my name. So I've simplified it to Ambily. However, I find that even though the pronunciation's been taken care of, we still have these name-related issues, right? So I frequently find that my name is spelt incorrectly on emails, even though the to column will have the right name, otherwise it wouldn't get to me. But people sometimes are a little bit careless when it comes to unusual names. And this is something that, I hear time and again from people saying that we have to kind of mold ourselves and make it easier for people to pronounce our name, to spell our name. And I know individuals have gone to abbreviating their names for ease. I've erred away from it because I feel like my parents call me this name for a very significant reason. And that's really important to me. So I've stuck with expecting people to spell out the full name.
It's a fascinating concept, but it also makes me slightly sad that we are changing things. As you say, your dad, who clearly named you this, was celestial, as you had said, gave this reason, this rhyme and reason to call you Ambily Bhaskaran. I actually really like that. But I love that we brought that up, and it makes me, often consider actually how much of ourselves we hide away from the surface level. My middle name that I often, in fact, I don't think I've ever said this in a podcast, is Wai Ming, which I believe means is either sun and moon or sun and moon and stars or something like that. in Chinese, but rarely use it. And actually, when you started introducing yourself, we kind of already see this. So I think it's an interesting and a beautiful name. There is the background, there is the heritage, there is where you came from, and then also who you are in the workplace. And I can see why the professional and personal path has led you to start spearheading other initiatives, both internal and also external to the organization. And it's also brilliant as well to see that the corporations and large organizations are really taking now very seriously the fact that employee resource groups, or ERGs, sometimes still called staff networks, or BRGs, just for anyone who's listening in wondering, or business resource groups, actually are such a fantastic way to be able to drive true engagement and to allow this safe place for freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and ultimately bringing us together. Now, you said, Ambily, that the organisation and the work that you've done has taken on great leaps and bounds, and you've been within the organisation for quite some years. How have you seen the evolution start to grow, both in terms of the gender perspective, the ethnicity perspective, and also other facets of diversity and ultimately intersectionality?
Yeah, so I think when a few years ago, intersectionality was a term that just wasn't thought of, right? So GSK as a company has really prioritized 4 dimensions of diversity. So gender, LGBTQ, race, and disability. But the first 2 were a lot more prominent within the company. So gender, we had gender targets in place. GSK were really applauded as one of the Times top 50 employers in gender. There was a lot more focus on even the employee resource groups with gender. But what has happened more recently is a realization that we've been far too siloed. So previously, when we talked about gender, it was initiatives that were helping women, but a certain subsection of women, without actually considering the whole gamut of women. So we weren't, we have what are called councils for each of the diversity dimensions. So we have a gender council, an ethnicity council, etc. And when I first looked at our gender council, we had 50% men, 50% women, but there was no women of color in that group. There were no men of color in that group, right? Our ethnicity council, when it was first set up, was equally lacking in diversity, right? So there was a real lack of focus on, even when it came to ethnicity, there was a real lack of focus in the leadership teams that were looking at it. There are very few people with the lived experiences driving these strategies, driving these initiatives. There wasn't the sort of passion, because you've lived through this and you kind of feel that passion of, this should not carry on, right? And so I think GSK has done a lot of work in the last year or so, and so have most organizations, in understanding that you cannot look at gender in isolation. You cannot look at race in isolation. A lot of these factors are overplayed. And now that we're focusing on race, we can't afford to leave other factors behind. You cannot afford to leave disability behind, or even factors that companies may not be prioritizing, whether it's age or social status. We need to actually have an awareness that an individual doesn't sit neatly in one box. There are many aspects to that individual's personality, and we need to do a much more tailored approach to support individuals.
I love that we're talking about intersectionality already. Pre-warning, I could talk about this all day, Ambily, so I'm excited to dive deep. What we do at Dial is we focus very much on these 10 aspects of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. And that would include everything, to your point, from race and ethnicity, parenthood, caring responsibilities, mental health and wellness, disability, race and ethnicity, all of these, and also, culture and heritage, because you're absolutely right. We do not fit neatly into these one boxes. You and I looking at each other right now through a computer screen, actually, we can see visibly that we are both female. We can see visibly that we are both women of color. Layered on top of that, the other other invisible disabilities, you start to see the bigger picture, the more holistic picture, whereby actually this is about appreciating people, to your point, of those differences. What is it that makes us up on the surface? What is it that makes us up below the surface? One, not to presume. Two, to seek out and find those answers. And three, to look at how we can tailor and measure that approach, because ultimately, if we are going to truly achieve equity, and people say, oh yes, it's all about equality, well, how can we get equality when we aren't recognizing that people start from very different places in life? This is simply about leveling the playing field. So when you say there we are benefiting one particular type, whether it be, for example, white women, that in and to itself is not pure inclusion. Inclusion is everyone.
Absolutely. And this is where I think a lot of these inclusive dialogues, inclusive initiatives, it's the employee resource groups that have really led these activities within companies. And for us, we made this realization about a year ago, really getting connected with the other employee resource groups and realizing we have a common enemy. We have a common thing we can all be tackling together, and that is bias, right? If we take away people making judgments on somebody because of something they can see or something they know about this individual, and putting them into a box so that everybody who looks like them is like this, if you tackle that underlying cause of bias, to your point, we can then start tackling what's causing the discrimination in the workplace. And then really the kind of recent focus really has been on how can we tackle discrimination actively? What is the solution? We know the bias exists. We know that everybody is biased against some factor. How do we actually tackle this? And the tackling part is all about allyship. We all have a voice in some context. We all have the capability to be an ally in some context. And how do we dial that up? Not just for a cause we care about, but for everyone else who doesn't seem to be in the same category as us, right?
No, it's very, very interesting. And I completely agree that every single person has the capability to make a difference. And also diversity relates to everyone. It isn't just those one or two things. And allyship is one of the biggest factors in actually physically moving that dial, because to be very candid about it, it is namely white males in the CEO and C-suite positions. And so getting that finite balance between one, making sure those individuals are bought in and understand the rationale, and that also diversity is related to them, whilst also lifting up others so that we can truly level that playing field. And, I do sometimes worry somewhat about the schools of thought that say diversity is not men, or diversity is not, someone who is white, because I think for us to actually truly change the dynamic, not only in hearts and minds, but also in the processes that need to then be embedded to exclude or to almost vilify certain leaders, it is not going to get us there any quicker, when, to your point, the common enemy is exclusion. It's that exclusionary behavior. People from all different walks of life and all different areas of intersectionality can be excluded, which I guess, drives me to this next point that I would love to hear your take on, is actually, the future of diversity. What does this look like? You take India, as one example, and I need to learn, and am really embracing learning more about Indian culture and the diversities within diversities and the caste systems, and so in each of those segments, there is a whole richness to each of those facets in and to themselves. Does this mean the future is diversities within diversities, ecosystems within ecosystems? The list can go on, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ethnic diversity is highly complex, right? I mean, because it looks so different. With gender, I think the challenge was easier, that we could say 50%, 50% male, female split, that you could kind of put some universal strategies in place. Race is not that simple, and there has to be a tailored approach per country, looking at the dynamics within that country. So I do a lot of my work within the UK, so it's one set of problems. But in a country like like India, where it's not a minority issue that we're talking about, but really we need to do segmentation to understand where is the crunch happening, what is it that's not working, so that our companies inside can reflect what our community outside looks like, right? And I think the underlying principle is the same. For me, it has to be data-driven decision making, right? It has to be looking at your local demographics and trying to understand where is it that it's falling apart. Is it that we're not attracting a certain subset of people because we're not going to where the talent exists? Is it because we are not enabling these people to thrive in our companies when they do eventually come in, that they feel compelled to leave because they don't feel there's any opportunity for them within the company? Or is it because they are, simply getting demotivated and stagnant in their careers and almost giving up on their careers, right? Which doesn't create a great inclusive environment. Your culture of your company is going to suffer if there are demotivated workforce, right? So for me, the future is really organizations being a bit more thoughtful about this. I think in the past, we've always put it in the too hard to deal with bucket, and organizations haven't addressed it. I think we need to shift to a world where we do collect data where it's allowed, where it's not illegal to collect certain data, and actually ask ourselves the difficult questions of where is it that the processes are falling down? Where is it that our systems are not working? And part of driving that change has to start with accountability right at the top. It has to start with leaders at the top of the organizations holding themselves accountable for making sure that inclusion and diversity is not some HR initiative that sits with your HR business partner. It is something that has to live and breathe by your senior leaders. Because at the end of the day, your workforce, your people in your organization are your most important asset, right? If they don't feel like they belong in your company, if they don't feel like they have any chance of going and reaching their full potential, why are they going to give you 110%? Right? They're always going to be looking for that organization that will give them that 110%. So it's in your interest, from a purely business perspective, it's in the company's interest to be prioritizing the right things and making sure that organizations are best prepared for the future.
At risk of sounding like it's the converted preaching to the converted here, I absolutely agree. And it would be great to tackle some of the challenges and now actions, because even sometimes I feel it, just being candid, when doing podcasts with, as I would say, inspirational individuals, leaders that truly care. But it can be emotionally taxing sometimes, and there is also that point of how far can we get whilst preaching to the converted. From the sounds of things, we think and believe very similar ultimate endpoints and goals, yet how we reach those points are very different. I will pick up on one of the things that you have said about this being a business interest, and ultimately, that is the key critical point. If hearts and minds are not yet one, is the fact that ultimately this is a business imperative. We have crossed the Rubicon. There is no going back. This is coming, whether it be CSR merging with supply chain diversity initiatives that meet with D&I initiatives, whether it be the fact that laws and legislation is changing, whether it be the fact that actually, to your point, our future generations of leaders won't stand for inequality anymore, because this digital continuum we find ourselves in, where actually you can take to Twitter, you can take to LinkedIn, you can take to professional platforms and pretty much say what you want. We live in a world which is, to an extent, especially in the Western world, there is freedom of speech, and that is to an extent encouraged. Therefore, why would organizations not address this before it is then too late. When we talk about leaders at the top and the fact that they are the ones who are driving change, that is a fact that is proven. If it doesn't start at the top, the diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity initiatives are no way near as successful. Much as it is wonderful also to look at the grassroots and the ground up initiatives, the most efficient way is ultimately to start at the top. And so looking at how we can send almost this waterfall effect happening, this snowball effect of good starting at the top, being visible and accountable, as you say, and how this can kind of seep through the branches, the trees, the roots and the branches, sorry, and affect our future generations of leaders who frankly don't want to work for organizations that have leaders that don't care. And we've seen over the last couple of months, certain well-known individuals fall from grace in very senior positions, having done or said the wrong thing, and it's come out on social media. So arguably, would it not be better to put one's head above the parapet, say something and do something now, as opposed to allowing it potentially then to come back and bite you at a later date?
Absolutely. I mean, there is a strong feeling that has grown in the last year or so that actually staying quiet and not getting involved in this tricky subject because I don't want to inadvertently get it wrong is no longer acceptable. Not acceptable to your workforce, not acceptable to the public who you're selling your products to. So there is absolutely an expectation that people need to be strong enough to speak up. And that does feel uncomfortable, especially when it comes to race, especially when it comes to topics that they don't know much about, right? There is this fear that inadvertently I'm going to put my foot in it and say the wrong thing, and then I could be called a racist. And there is that fear playing on people's minds. And I think there's two things, right? From my perspective, that there is, yes, a justified fear. But if you are fearful, you're never going to change this landscape where you have the power to change it. You have the responsibility to actually make yourself a little bit uncomfortable and put yourself out there. But before you do that, educate yourself on what's going on. Have some informal conversations in a safe space with employee resource groups or resources out there, or even Google, and educate yourself on some things that you need to be aware of, so you know what you're talking about. On the other side, I would also say to people in my community, we need to not pounce on people who have the best intentions and who accidentally, if their intent is positive and they're taking action, not just a positive intent and sitting back and doing nothing, but if people have the right intent and they are taking action, we need to be a little forgiving. Sometimes people are scared to get involved in the race agenda because they're worried that they are going to get pushed down from both sides, and I think we need to cultivate an environment where allies feel strong and empowered to be that voice by supporting this agenda. And as you said, the tide isn't changing. The future generations that are coming through expect societal justice to be at the forefront of companies, right? So we do need to tackle it.
I really love the fact that you've picked up on what is actually, interestingly, quite a controversial point. Truthfully, I am completely with you, but I know there would be a number of people who would not agree with me and or us on the not pouncing on people with good intentions. To build on that somewhat, and I give you an example here, we did our summit last week, and we had over 50% of our speakers happen to be female, with the vast majority of those who were female being also ethnic minority individuals and leaders. So my point is, it was a mixture of many different facets of diversity. And we had a panel which was males, white males, and we had a number of people who jumped on immediately saying, this is a manel, this is unacceptable, this is, and it really deeply upset me, actually, because I thought to myself, first and foremost, this is exactly what we are trying to do collectively, and that is move the dial, to actually have a number of very senior chief executives who are white, who are male, who are of a certain age category. It is not their fault, but what would be their fault would be as if they didn't do something about it. And so you end up then with, again, to your point, is this concern and fear over vilification. Don't shoot them down when they're trying to make a change and it comes from a good place, because that drives further fear, insecurity, concern over speaking about such subjects. And that really, whilst controversial, I know people listening in, who may well think, you know what, you should have had diversity on that panel. But the point we always try and make is diversity, it simply means difference. And everyone comes from a different place. Can we say that all white men are the same? Can we say that all Chinese or Indian females are the same? Absolutely not. And if we're seeking for positive change in humanity, for us to be able to get along, be more productive, drive more innovation, why would we cut people down at the knees when we want for good? And if I was to go even harsher than that, I would say pure stupidity on the fact that we are going to alienate a category of people that can drive the very most by way of allyship. But again, not everyone would agree with me, but I love your thoughts. And it makes me happy that you brought that up, because it's something that I don't think gets talked about anywhere near enough.
Absolutely, Leila. It's not a particularly popular opinion, right? I think rightly so. The community want people to be taking positive action, and racism has existed for hundreds of years, and people are fed up. I totally get that. But I agree, currently today's state of affairs is most organizations have a almost exclusively white leadership team. These are the people with the power that need to change what the status quo is. And in order for them to change, they have got there almost through a lack of awareness that they were somehow disadvantaging somebody. They followed what they were taught. They followed to make connections. They followed the advice they were given, etc. It's not necessarily because they have trampled over ethnic minorities to get there. They just had certain advantages that ethnic minorities didn't have, of sponsorship or connections or the right mentorship at the right time, whatever it was, right? So now that we have, certainly in the conversations I've had with a lot of allies, as soon as they realize the inequities and they realize the lived experiences that they had never come across before, they have suddenly kind of owned that ownership that, we have a certain level of privilege, even if they've had a tough time getting to the top. They have had certain privileges just because of their color or their background or whatever it is. And there is a real focus on and responsibility on those individuals who are now driving the change really passionately alongside us, and we need more of them. So actually, if we, and they will get things wrong because they haven't got the same lived experience. They are new to this game, just like any of us. When we start somewhere new, we have a long learning curve ahead of us. If you then pull down these allies who are just starting on the journey, what's the impact on the other allies who are looking up to this person? They're going to be even more scared to join this conversation. So absolutely, there's an emphasis on our community to welcome allies along who want to do good, who want to take action, not just for a tick box exercise, but genuinely want to change this agenda and want to help accelerate the pace of change in organizations. I am all for that, even if they occasionally stumble. Provided they're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach them the ropes.
Well, I am in so much agreement with that, in so much agreement. And in the same way that you and I would, I'm sure, positively argue that visible representation is incredibly important. I mean, I would have loved to see, and I was adopted by amazing white British parents. My parents to me are role models. But it would have also been nice to see real models. I see few East Asian faces with a similar background, and it would have made a difference. And it's heartbreaking to hear younger generations say, if I can't see it, then I can't be it. Therefore, the visible representation is important. But flipping the coin to the other side, with your mention of allies inspiring other allies, the same is true. Therefore, having a positive, let's say in this example, a white male ally, then speaking to another white male ally from a certain, category, probably not the right word, but category in inverted commas of person, that is where the real movement starts to actually drive. I've interviewed a number of chief executives, male chief executives, white chief executives, who then have gone off, really understood, and then spoken to their peers, other white chief executives, lo and behold, who then start to drive this change. And so, it does so much take all of us. And I'm so pleased that we have got onto this subject. I think it is one that is so powerful. It takes every one of us. We may look diverse on the outside, but hey, do you know what? We've got to keep positively spreading this message, because we are only doing ourselves a disservice by, it's like, what were the kind of age-old adages of, you don't eradicate hate and discrimination by adding on top of that even more of that. It doesn't produce a solution. But Ambily, I could talk to you forever and a day about all of this stuff. This is just brilliant. I've got to go into a quick lightning round. So I had a quick glance at the clock, then thought, oh my goodness. Ambily, let's rock into the lightning round. And my fault, but I will give you 30 seconds to answer each question. And I will say as little as I can in between each, because the point is to hear your voice on this podcast. Now, starting off with the most difficult question first. What would you say is your secret to success?
Oh, wow. Constantly learning. Actually, I am always curious, and I don't think you stop learning until the day you die. So constantly keeping an eye on what is it that I can improve about myself is probably the secret to the success.
Mm-hmm. It's a great answer. I remember I said recently to my counsellor, or she'd said to me actually, we are all children really until the day that we die. Very philosophical, but actually, we don't ever stop learning. We must be always open to new ideas and to education and inspiration. And what about some of the biggest influences in your life? Who have been your inspirations, whether they be sheroes, whether they be heroes, whether they be people without a gender? I'm not sure. Tell me.
So I, growing up, was inspired by people like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, people who brought about societal change. Those are the true heroes in my life. I've never equated it to success from a money perspective. It's always been who has done the most for people to improve the lives of millions. I would say in the business world, I have been totally inspired by a fantastic senior leader who has just been very down to earth, has always, even despite their seniority, they've always kept their ear to the ground and included people in their conversations. So a lady called Dr. Pim Khan, who was a very early influence at GSK, who I've always admired.
Wow. Well, she must be spectacular, this Dr. Pim Khan, for you to say this. And it's very, very inspiring to hear that it's someone from within your organization. And, it just goes to show that actually having other leaders who can not only lift others up, but also mentor, guide, and ultimately sponsor others within that business. It's that that shared learning, like that melting pot of growing talent. Excellent. And finally, if you could go back in time, and maybe this is back in Curler, I'm not sure, but if you could go back in time, you could talk to the much younger version of yourself, the young Amberly, or someone who's in a similar situation, considering where to go and what adventure to embark on next, what would you say to that young you?
I think like most women, I've lacked confidence in my own abilities, particularly when I was younger. I didn't believe that I would even get a PhD before I embarked on it. And through my career at every stage, I've thought, I'm not sure if I can do this job, and, had that imposter syndrome. So I would always tell my younger self, believe in yourself, you are good enough, and kind of really have that almost as a visualization tool to kind of put something somewhere that I reinforce time and again. It's taken me a long time to get to that point of accepting that I'm good enough. So I would have accelerated that at a much younger age.
Wow. Well, thank you so very much, Ambily. You have been superb. And true to form, I always do a brief summary, but I'm kind of like, where do I start here? I think some of the things that have really resonated with me, and I'm sure with many, are this real true sense of what equity versus equality means. Actually, the recognition of the fact that every single one of us are different. Every single one of us has a story to tell, a voice to be heard, something different to bring to the party. But I particularly like some of the actionable points from yourself, Ambily, where we were talking about this, this empowerment to make own decisions, and the fact that we must utilize data to drive decision making, along with a number of other areas. Driving awareness, just simply saying that we want to change is just not enough. But hearing some of the growth, not only within your own organization at GSK through the benefit of employee resource groups, and now even more so bringing these together so that we have less of the silo effect, I think is where the future for general employee resource groups, business resource groups shall start to go. And finally, that conversation around allyship and the fact that ultimately none of us is as smart as all of us, and making sure that we get to the place that we all wish to be, that of equality, by championing and lifting up and advising, educating, informing one another to get collectively better, really did hugely resonate, because it is by being positive, it is by holding each other accountable, and holding hands with our brothers, sisters, other human beings, that we will manage to make a true sustainable change for our future generations of leaders. So Ambily, thank you.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
My name is Leila Mackenzie-Dellis, and you've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast show, brought to you by Dial Global. You've been listening to the excellent Ambily Banerjee of GSK, heading up brilliant employee resource group. Do make sure that you check us out on your favorite podcast app, whether it be Apple or Spotify. You can join us directly in the Dial Global app. It's in the App Store, Dial Global Network, or visit us, and you can see all the show notes as well from today's show at www.dialglobal.org. Take care and see you again next week. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.